I had 460 contacts in my phone, and I couldn't find one man to call. Not one. And I sat there on that couch, scrolling and scrolling. And the longer I scrolled, the worse it got, because I started to realize this wasn't bad luck. And it wasn't a rough patch, and it wasn't something that had happened to me. I had built this. One reasonable decision at a time. For 25 years, here's how it happened. I slipped on a wet floor in a warehouse in Dayton on a Tuesday. Nothing serious. Deep bruise. Go home and rest. So I went home. My wife was at work. House was quiet. And somewhere around 2 in the afternoon on day 2, I picked up my phone to call somebody just to talk, just to hear a voice, and I scrolled through every name I had, and not one of them felt right. And I put the phone down and sat there in the silence and thought, when did this happen? Not because I'd fought with anyone, not because I was hard to be around, but because at 55 years old, after building everything I was supposed to build, I had somehow ended up completely alone and I hadn't even noticed. That's what I never said out loud. Until now. Stay with me, because I promise you, the way it happened is closer to your life than you want to admit. My name is Gary. I'm 55. I've been in regional sales for building materials for 22 years, which means I've spent roughly half my adult life in a rental car somewhere between Columbus and Cincinnati. Eating a gas station sandwich and telling myself this is temporary. It was never temporary. I married Karen when I was 29. We have 2 kids, Brendan, who's 24 and lives in Austin. Mia, 21, finishing her last year at Ohio State. Good kids. Karen is a good woman. We have a house, to paid-off cars, a lawn that I take unreasonably seriously for a man who claims not to care about grass. On paper, I built exactly what I was supposed to build. The thing about a career in sales is that it gives you the illusion of connection. I talk to people all day long. Clients, reps, my regional team. I was good at it. I mean, genuinely good. The kind of good where people remember your name and take your calls. I shook hands with men in work boots and men in conference rooms and men in both at the same time. And I called it a network, and I told myself it counted. I had 460 LinkedIn connections. I want you to hold that number in your mind. But when I sat on that couch with an ice pack on my shoulder and tried to think of one guy, just one, who I could call and say, hey, I had a rough day, you got a few minutes? The 460 LinkedIn connections were spectacularly useless. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this hadn't happened to me. I had built it, and I was about to find out exactly how. The last real friend I had was a guy named Dave. We met in our 30s, kids the same age. Lived 10 minutes apart, used to watch football on Sundays when the season lined up right. He was the kind of guy you could sit with for 3 hours and not feel like you had to perform. That's rare. I didn't know how rare until I didn't have it anymore. What happened to Dave? Nothing dramatic. His company transferred him to Phoenix in 2016. We said we'd stay in touch. We texted for about a year, game scores. The occasional meme about getting old, and then the texts got further apart, and then they stopped. And neither one of us made a move to fix it. And now I'd feel strange calling him out of the blue after 3 years of nothing, which is insane, by the way. We are grown men. We are not in 7th grade. There is no reason a 55-year-old cannot call another 55-year-old and say, hey, I miss talking to you. And yet, here we are. 2 idiots waiting for the other one to go first. Before Dave, there was Marcus from my first sales job. And before Marcus, there were 4 or 5 guys from college whose names I can still remember, but whose faces I'm starting to lose. Every single one of those friendships ended the same way. Not with a fight, not with a betrayal, with nothing. With busy, with we should get together soon repeated until the phrase lost all meaning and became a kind of polite goodbye that both people understood was permanent. But here's the part that really got me. I wasn't the victim of circumstance. I was the one who built the door and locked it from the inside. And I had a very good reason for every single lock. Because every time a friendship started to fade, I made the same calculation. I had a wife. I had kids. I had a job that demanded 60 hours a week and called it 40. Something had to give, and the thing that gave was always the friendships, because they felt optional in a way that everything else didn't. I told myself, I'm being responsible. I'm being a good husband, a good father, a good provider. What I was actually doing was building a life with no room for anyone who didn't need something from me. And then one day, I needed something, and there was nobody there. So I did what any self-respecting sales manager would do. I made a plan, and it was the most embarrassing thing I've done in 20 years of professional life. So here's what I did on day 3 of sitting on that couch. I made a plan. Because I am a regional sales manager, and that is what we do. We identify a problem. We build a pipeline. We execute. I actually opened a notes app. I want you to know that. I made a friendship spreadsheet. I am not proud of this. I listed 6 names. Men I used to know. Men I respected. Men who probably thought of me the same way I thought of Dave, as someone who disappeared without explanation, and I called the first one on the list. His name is Rob. We worked together about 12 years ago. Good guy. I always liked Rob. The call lasted 11 minutes. I timed it because the silence was so loud I needed to know how long I was surviving it. We talked about work. We talked about our kids in that vague, highlight reel way. Yeah, she's doing great. It's really finding her footing, which is what you say when you don't actually know what your kid is going through. We made a plan to grab a beer sometime. I knew when I said it that we wouldn't. He knew it too. We were both too polite to acknowledge that. I hung up and sat there and thought, that was the loneliest 11 minutes of my year. Because the problem wasn't that Rob was a bad person. The problem was that I'd called him like I was cold calling a prospect with an agenda. With a script, with the goal of closing something. And human connection doesn't work like that. You can't manufacture in 11 minutes what you've neglected for 12 years. If that hit you somewhere familiar, hit subscribe. I'm not done yet. That phone call showed me something I'd been avoiding since I sat down on that couch. The problem wasn't that I'd lost my friends. The problem was that I'd never learned how to keep them because nobody had ever taught me that. Keeping them required anything at all. And that's when I started thinking about my father, and I realized the problem wasn't mine. It was inherited. And that changed everything about how I understood what I had to do next. Part 5. The Understanding. 6:15 to 7:40, my dad was a good man. I want to be clear about that. He worked hard, he kept his word, he showed up. He was at every game, every graduation. He never missed the things that were supposed to matter, but I cannot tell you the name of a single one of his friends, not one. I thought about it for a long time, sitting on that couch. I could picture my dad on a Saturday, mowing the lawn, fixing something in the garage, watching the game alone in his chair. I could picture him at family events, at work functions. But I could not picture him on the phone with another man just talking. I could not picture him making plans that weren't practical, that didn't have a purpose. He didn't have friends either, and he never once talked about it like it was a loss, which means I didn't learn that it was a loss. I learned that it was just how men lived. And I had been living that way so long I didn't even know I was dying of it until a guy named Paul said something that I haven't stopped thinking about since. I talked to my brother-in-law about this. Karen's brother, Paul. Paul's 61. Been through his own version of this. He's one of those guys who'll say the true thing, even when it's uncomfortable. I called him because he was on my list, and because talking to him has never felt like that 11-minute call with Rob. He said, Gary, men my age, we were raised to need nothing. Needing something from another man felt like weakness. So we got real good at being self-sufficient. And then we woke up at 60 and realized self-sufficient is just another word for alone. I didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, the question isn't why you don't have friends. The question is whether you're willing to be bad at making them out loud in front of another person. At 55 years old, I told him that sounded terrible. He laughed and said, yeah, it kind of is. But I kept thinking about what Paul said. And about 3 weeks later, I did something so simple, it was almost embarrassing. And it cracked something open that I didn't know was sealed shut. I texted Dave. That's it. That was the whole plan. After all that analysis, after the friendship spreadsheet, After the most painful 11-minute phone call of my career, I picked up my phone and I sent one text to a guy I hadn't really talked to in 3 years. Not a long text. Not a, "Hey, I've been doing a lot of reflection and I miss our friendship." Text because I would rather sand my own knees than send something like that. I kept it simple. I said, "Hey, I've been thinking.